Hello and welcome to Iain Dale All Talk. This is normally just a podcast. Today we are filming it for the first time, and it's a podcast where we try and get to know people in the media and in politics a little bit better. I like talking to people who've had an interesting career in one way or another. Well, today we're going to talk to Peter Riddell. Now, you will all know him from, he was on the Financial Times, on the Times, he chaired the Institute for Government and the Hansard Society. So lots to talk about. We're both political geeks, so we ought to have a good little chat, I think, Peter. Now, where should we start? Let's start. How did you first get into journalism, and why did you want to be a journalist?
I first got into journalism at the end of my university career, and I wrote I hadn't done much undergraduate journalism at all. I wrote 3 cheeky letters. I wrote one to The Economist, and I got a rejection from the then managing editor. Roll on a few decades, and my wife became managing editor of The Economist, and she said the letter was far too polite. I wrote to the Times, who said, get a bit more experience, young man, and I spent the second half of my career there. And I got a letter from the FT saying, if you happen to be in London in the reasonable future, could you pop in and see us? So surprise, surprise, the following week I was in London and was interviewed by someone I fortunately did not know his reputation, Gordon Newton, who in a sense was the person who created I don't know, you call it pre-modern, you can't call it modern because it's 50 years since he was editor, but he created a recognisable Financial Times, which wasn't just a tip sheet or a banking thing. Out of the Bracken era, he transformed it. And he was very terse, and he was quite aggressive. So he asked me a question like, do you read the paper every day? And I said, no, I only read it a few days a week. Plus point for me. And he carried on like that. And then he pressed his intercom and said to the then managing editor, oh, we'll have him. And I was startled. And then the salary was an NUJ minimum, National Union Journalist minimum. I think it was $1,700 a year, which was $500 more than the going rate for graduates in 1970. I naughtily carried on with my application to civil service. And I got to the final stage, which was then in Savile Row, imposing buildings in Savile Row. And I was interviewed, and the main interview at the final stage, first question to me was, if you're asked, if you're offered a job by Fleet Street Paper and by us, which would you take?
Did they know?
But no, that was the thing. And I thought, expletive deleted. And so I actually gave, I thought, a semi-honest answer, given I'd already accepted a job with the FT, which is I'd probably take the job with journalism. And the second question was equally penetrating. The questioner was one John Hunt, later Lord Hunt of Tamworth, Cabinet Secretary. Roll on, 15 years or more, I was opposite him at a dinner party, and I reminded him of this, because obviously he'd forgotten, why the hell should he remember that? Yeah. And he said, do you make the right choice? And I said, well, you read the FT, you could tell. But it was one of those kind of weird things in political life and the media life. You recurrently meet people. And that's how I got to journalism.
But that was a real sliding doors moment, wasn't it? Because, I mean, had you taken the opposite path, you could have been Sir John Hunt 15 years later, or 20 or 25.
And I'd have been retired for a long time. Yes. The lucky thing is, here am I in my early 70s, and I'm still busy. And a lot of my contemporaries, and if I'd gone into the civil service, I'd been retired a long time ago. And so I've been lucky because I like doing things. I'm rather like you. I can never see you retiring yet.
Sometimes too many things. One of the things that I've always liked about you is that you just love politics. Yeah. You have a respect for politics, I think, which a lot of people in modern day journalism, I don't think, do. And I mean, you wrote a book about sort of in defence of politics, which I had the pleasure of publishing many years ago. Do you think things have changed in journalism in the way that journalists view politics and politicians?
They've changed in both healthy and unhealthy ways. When I first got involved as a full-time political journalist, I had been economics correspondent of the FT in the late 70s. So I did the IMF crisis, all the dramas with Dennis Healey and all that.
When I was 12.
When you were 12, yes. And that, to do that in my late 20s was a fantastic thing to do.
Absolutely.
Far too young. And I got to know Healey, which was an incredible experience. But then I became the FT's political editor at the age of 33. And I was lucky in a way, because I was always fascinated, partly because I did a couple of years of history at university. I was always fascinated by power and politics, and I saw the Harold Wilson speak and others speak, and I also met people like Harold Macmillan and so on. And I was all very interested in the dynamics of politics. At that stage, I think, remember, political journalism was a pretty small world. It was way before 24-hour news, internet. Tim Berners-Lee hadn't had his great thoughts. So one was talking about, well, in 82, 83, Channel 4 came along. So before then, there were 3 TV channels, pretty limited number of radio channels, dominated by the newspaper political editors, which I was fortunate to run. So it was a closed world, which meant you had fantastic access, but it was quite a hierarchical one. I mean, I was regarded as a kind of young whippersnapper, along with my good friend Jim Naughtie. We went from the Scotsman to the Guardian, and we're great friends, but he was of that generation. So we were a very different generation, and it enabled you to get to know people pretty well. Now, the downside of it was that it was too close, that things were covered up or accepted and so on. And I think that the things broke open, really. I think 24-hour news was a key thing. I mean, some people focus on the challenge to the lobby system by the Indian and the Guardian. That was more a reflection of changes. It was much more significant was, say, 24-hour news, that you had a camera outside for Millbank and along the gardens and all that all the time. That was the real change. And I saw that during my time of covering Margaret Thatcher. So breaking it open was a good thing. The trouble was it's led more, I think, because of the internet and because of Twitter and so on, to a kind of a constant pressure on politicians, which makes them defensive. And the rise of the SPAD was always playing a defensive game on behalf of their master, or an aggressive game, discrediting other people, means that there's much less trust. I mean, all the things you read about in your book last year, all those phenomena where we can't get on, and mutual respect. And I think that has broken down. There was a degree of mutual respect. And obviously, we shouldn't romanticize it. There were enormous political arguments. But there wasn't a sense of narrowly coming out for advantage or playing it clever on Twitter or whatever.
What's your family background and education? Because I always think that plays quite a big part in how a particularly political journalist develops over the years.
Yeah, I was in kind of impoverished political class, professional class, and not political at all. My father had served in the RAF during the war and had a fantastic, I mean, I think it's the high point of his life, really. He met my mother in the RAF. He was lucky enough to be at Stanmore and during the Battle of Britain. He was an intelligence officer. I mean, he was a lawyer. He was a solicitor by training, who had been born in Rotherham. At some point, I always used to make with William Hague. So, you know, he's not the only person from Rotherham, even though my accent's rather different from his. And but then moved because of my grandfather's health to Torquay, where, in fact, I was born. He was a lawyer, was in the RAF, but he got TB and in the 1950s, before it was kind of temporarily eradicated for several days. So his practice collapsed. So we weren't at all well off. And I won a place at Dulwich College, which I'm currently chairman of governors of. Just had to step down from that after 6 years, which was paid for by the local authorities. 85% of the places at Dulwich in that era, people like Peter Lilly, Eddie George.
Nigel Farage?
No, he was a later generation. Nigel was quite a lot younger than me, and he was when they'd phased out this. I mean, right. When he'd gone there. No, Nigel's very proud. He's very proud of his contact with Dulwich. Anyway, I was paid for like 85% of people. Otherwise, I couldn't have gone there because we really were not well off. So,
that's another crucial moment in your life, though, isn't it? Because if you hadn't gone there, if you'd gone to Torquay High School or whatever, would you have ended up where you are?
Well, exactly,
no one will know.
You're absolutely right, Ian, because the academic standards there were very, very high indeed. A lot of us got into, I got into Cambridge, a lot got into Oxford. I mean, the figures were phenomenal at the time. It was very hot house, probably too hot house, actually. It was okay if you were reasonably bright, but we were brilliantly taught. That partly gave me my love of politics. Being in London in the 1960s, seeing all that and seeing we lived in Streatham. So Duncan Sands was my MP, and famously said, I was elected to represent Streatham in Westminster, not Westminster in Streatham, even though it's half an hour on the bus. Not something I'm sure he ever took, the bus. Well, I remember with friends going to heckle him at a meeting, and this was after the allegations over the Duchess of Argyll. So my friend shouted some pretty lively heckling. I showed my natural cowardice by not heckling. Anyway, so I got interested in politics from then, and at university I kind of veered all over the political thing, but from starting off as a kind of progressive Tory to being moderate Labour, and then really realising that politics probably wasn't for me. Because I didn't feel strong enough.
So you actually did think about politics at one point?
I thought about it, yeah. But this, I'm talking about when I was at university. Yeah. And I did think about it, but then I concluded that I didn't have the degree of absolute commitment. I mean, a lot of my contemporaries, there was a whole... I mean, some Labour contemporaries, people like Charles Clarke, Patricia Hewitt on the Labour side, Helene Hayman, who was First Lord Speaker. On the Tory side, there was quite a range of people. None of whom there was an earlier Tory generation at Cambridge, which was the Michael Howard, Ken Clarke, Norman Lamont generation. They'd all gone because they're quite a bit older. But my generation was Richard Ryder, who
used to share an office with him when I had my first job in the Commons. He never actually... I think I saw him in the office once.
He had a reputation at university of being a hellraiser.
Really?
Yeah, I know, exactly. Everyone says that.
I mean, that's astonishing.
I know. People change dramatically. One person who hasn't changed is one David Mellor. And David was a contemporary. And I remember one of my contemporaries who became a Tory minister, then sadly got a stroke and died, John Watts, who was...
I remember him. I used to have dealings with him as a transport minister over ports privatisation and railways.
Yeah, and he was a very bright guy, but he was very much kind of working-class Tory, very much from a comprehensive and so on. And John was a friend of mine, and I remember when I came back from the States that we were just chatting about what had happened to our contemporaries. And there were a lot of them floating around, people like Roger Evans, William Powell, Spencer Batiste, completely forgotten figures now.
Apart from people like me.
Yeah, but I mean...
I remember them.
But they were all kind of contemporary, so there's no one... anyway, I remember John saying, we were talking about how people had changed, and we said how much Richard Ryder had changed, and then said David Mellor, no, David hasn't changed.
You see, when you said about being in London in the 1960s, I was trying to imagine what Peter Riddell was like in London in the 1960s. Well, did you take full advantage of the opportunities offered to you, Peter? That's what I'm asking.
The answer is no.
Damn.
My wife reminds me of this constantly, that I was someone who didn't really live through the 60s. The 60s didn't really happen for me at all. I've never smoked nicotine, but I also certainly never smoked anything else either. And so that whole era, I was rather prim.
Looking back on that, though, do you have any regrets about that? Because I think there are... I remember... I mean, I obviously wasn't in London in the 1960s, but there were times, I remember when I went to live in Germany in the 1980s, and all the things I could have got up to, but actually didn't.
I know why, because my father had died when I was 15, 16. We weren't well off. All the psychological pressures of that. Yeah. That's the reason. I mean, I know exactly why. I'd got into Cambridge. I did reasonably well there, and I got onto the FT when I was 21, 22. So, I had a lot of obvious success, but it was very much driven to... I couldn't fall back on anything. I had nothing to fall back on. I had to succeed, so to speak. And I quite enjoyed it in a rather conventional way. But I was a very conventional person, I still am. But I mean, I do, yes, when I look back on the films, and my hair was a bit, looking at photos, my hair was a bit longer than it is now. Everyone's was. I've seen younger photos of you, Ian.
Yeah, I know. I used to have a wonderful head of hair.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, but you're right. You do look back on it and think, well, I missed out on that. And I've never been a great pop music person, and also I've never wanted. I don't regret having missed out on drugs or anything like that. But the other point is, when I really came to London, which was the 70s, I graduated in 1970. The 70s was an awful decade because of a combination of bombs, high inflation, the strikes, and so on. odd enough, Bernard Donoghue's diaries bring it through very clearly. It was a kind of miserable time in a way. I mean, I remember 2 or 3 times walking through London and hearing bombs go off in the distance. Very difficult to convey to people.
Yeah.
And even though I was pretty well off, and I bought my first flat then and all that, it wasn't a decade. I mean, it was a professionally successful decade for me, but personally, I found it rather arid.
Well, I can remember that was the decade of my teens, I suppose. And I literally can remember where I was, I think, watching a news bulletin about all the terrible things that you've just talked about and thinking, there must be a better way than this, that this cannot be how things are meant to be. And it was an important decade in a way, particularly in politics. And that, I mean, you'd got interested in politics before me, but it was sort of the 3-day week, all of that era, that really sparked my political interest, even though what was I, 11? Which is kind of sad in a way, isn't it?
But it was a double-edged thing. I mean, no, I don't think it was sad at all, because it was a very momentous thing for the country we're in. I think I certainly admit I was slow on appreciating Thatcher's impact, but I wasn't slow on appreciating we had to have a change of direction. And certainly, for example, what Geoffrey Howe and Nigel Lawson were trying to do on economic policy, which of course had its forerunner in what some of the stuff Dennis Healey was doing, even though he disavowed it later. In practice, the shift away from post-war economic policy, the Keynesianism, was really occurring in the second half of the 70s. And it clearly couldn't go on. But Thatcher herself, I'm sorry Charles Moore's biography is so good, is realising, well, couldn't quite believe in her initially. I quite quickly realised what an extraordinary person she was. I mean, she's very interesting as a journalist, because got close. I mean, she got close to some editors, but the kind of working journalists like me, she never particularly got close to. I mean, I knew the other people. I mean, say Geoffrey Howe, Nigel Lawson, to some extent Norman Tebbit, Cecil Parkinson certainly. I got to know much better, because with her there was always a distance. But you know, she was one of the most remarkable people in my journalistic career. I mean, without any question, seeing her operate under pressure, the Falklands, with Reagan, with Gorbachev, and so on, absolutely extraordinary times.
So you were at the FT from when till when?
70 to 91. So I did a series of. I worked on the city side. My first boss was a man who wore a bowler hat, and had objected to the Tories when they introduced capital gains tax in 1961-62. He was a very traditional figure. And then I was property correspondent during the property boom of the early 70s, which was ridiculously young. But I learnt an enormous amount from various people, including a very shy man who developed a warehousing along the M4 called David Young, who subsequently surfaced, was less shy about publicity, as I reminded him later on, Lord Young of Graffham.
And of course, he's got a book coming out in June, his diary of the 87 election. We should explain for younger listeners that he was, Margaret Thatcher brought him in. He'd been a chairman of the Manpower Services Commission,
right,
hadn't he? And she brought him in as a businessman, which very rarely works in politics, but it kind of did with him. And he was co-chairman of the Conservative Party in the 87 election with Norman Tebbit, and they did not hit it off at all. So he's going to be sitting in that seat in June.
Right.
So I'm rather looking forward to that.
David was prestigious. I covered all that. Then I became economics correspondent, which was the real job which made me for 5.5 years, covering the crises of the late 70s. And that was a wonderful, wonderful job. And then political editor in 81, and I carried on doing politics for most of my career, apart from time in the States at the end of the 80s, early 90s.
Because it is quite important as a young journalist to have different beats, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because I think nowadays often people start in politics and end in politics. But I remember in my short-lived written journalistic career, I went into Lloyd's List as an insurance correspondent, knew nothing about insurance, cared even less. But it was the most brilliant thing that could have happened, because I found out I could write about things that I didn't know about. And I imagine you found that as well with some of the areas that you were covering.
Very much so. Having been a financial journalist, and particularly, say, doing property or something, was an immense advantage, and then doing the economy. Because the economy was so dominant during the 80s anyway. It was a big, big advantage. One, because I knew the people in the Treasury and so on, and also the relevant ministers. I got to know them very well. And also being on the FT. I remember I used to get phone calls in the mid-late 70s from a very eager young city spokesman who desperate to plant stories. He recently resurfaced with rather a lot of long hair as an aged rock star, one Tony Blair. But he was an enormous advantage having done the City Beat earlier on and so on. And that was a great thing. I think the moving around, you're absolutely right, Ian. I mean, I tried to persuade one very successful political journalist, go to the States, go and spend 3 or 4 years there. And a few papers do it. The Times and the FT have done a bit that, moving people to and from. You gain an awful lot from. I mean, I wish I'd had a gift for language, which I don't have at all. And I'd love to have worked in Germany or France or wherever. Or my daughter's got a degree in Mandarin, and her understanding of China as a result of that is fantastic. But I just wish I'd done a greater variety of things. In fact, I travelled an awful lot with Thatcher and then the elder Bush when I was in the States.
Oh no, you must have some stories about Thatcher travels. Julia Langdon has. She went on lots of trips with her. Has always got things to retell. But I mean, everybody's got an anecdote about meeting Margaret Thatcher, haven't they?
Well, two anecdotes. One is in '85, after Reagan was re-elected, she went and addressed Congress. Well, no, great things. And there was a great dinner at the British Embassy. And I was Bernard Ingham, who I always got on very well with, said, you can come to the dinner, Peter. So I took my dinner jacket out and all that. And I sit next to Bernard. Mark Thatcher appears. And this was, height of Thatcher's power. You thought Bernard, the most loyalist of loyalists, turns round and said, "Who let that little bee in?" And I thought, what's all this about? Of course, one subsequently discovered this is the height of the controversy over Oman and various other things. I mean, Bernard was not alone in thinking she was too indulgent towards him. Again, comes out well in Charles Moore. And I just remember that vivid. The other thing from that evening was Reagan was telling a joke. And Reagan was a wonderful speaker. I mean, the perfect, the man you couldn't dislike in that way. And she interrupted him.
In the middle of a joke?
In the middle of a joke. And he just turned. Nancy was also there, so not a free song. And then just turned and said, "There you go, Maggie. Perfect put down." Other stories, in the pre-election visit to Moscow in '87, which was the triumphant visit. At the same time, as we now know, that Number 10 was screwing Neil Kinnock on his visit to see Reagan, and it was being totally mucked around. That Thatcher had this triumphant visit. I mean, it was the most extraordinary thing. And part of her love-in was Gorbachev. And we were flying back from Tbilisi in Georgia late at night, and the old VC-10, because she would never upgrade, wouldn't waste taxpayers' money and all that stuff. And I had, being an RAF plane, the seats faced backwards. And leaning on the aisle seat was Bernard, and next to him Charles Powell. And she was talking about, and she was on a high. She knew this was a triumph. The election would be in a few weeks' time. And someone said to her, "Well, what are your plans for the future?" "Oh, go on and on and on." And Bernard, in his typical fashion, turned to me and said, "I'll never bloody well be able to retire now." Charles Powell looked at me, lifted his eyebrows. Within less than 4 years, of course, she was gone. But those little, but you always, the other story, 87 election you mentioned, I'd stayed in this area where we are now. I'd stayed at Labour headquarters, Transport House, to talk to Neil Kinnock after his press conference. I can't remember what it was. And the FT's team obviously had someone in the Tory press conference. I came and it was full up, the room in the old Smith Square Tory headquarters. So I just stood outside watching the monitor. She comes out, looks at me and said, "You didn't ask your usual question today, Mr. Riddell." Behind her was Norman Tebbit. And I said, no, it's okay, Prime Minister, I've just stayed behind at Labour conference. "Well, what happened there?" So I gave her a kind of very brief gobbit of what happened. And meanwhile, Tebbit, because who was much taller than her, was trying to stop laughing at this point. "Well, you want to know what happened at our press conference?" And she gave me kind of 4 or 5 minutes summary of it, prime ministerial type. Again, Tebbit was just roaring with laughter behind it. That was typical of her, that we were pupils. And I'd been a bit naughty because I'd missed class. And therefore I had to be brought up to date for my homework. And that was, in a sense, also, going back to an earlier point I made, about the culture of a small number of political editors who were involved in a dialogue. Of course, we don't have press conferences nowadays, isn't that way? That's all gone. Great loss, that, actually, because it produced a dialogue. And I'm very glad I'm not covering general elections now, because they look so arid.
and they are.
Yeah.
I mean, I love elections. I'm a complete elections nerd. But I have to say, the last 2 elections, covering them as a broadcaster, I've hated them because even if you get people that the parties put up, very rarely do they ever have any intention of saying anything. And it's just become monotonous. But the thing I liked about that anecdote is that she called you Mr. Riddell. Because can you imagine any leading politician now calling a journalist Mr., Mrs. or Miss? Just wouldn't happen, would it? It's all first names.
Well, I've always had a rule that with prime ministers and so on, it should always be, there should be an element of respect there. I even did it. I was at Lord's Cricket, and the then Mayor of London was dashing by with his rucksack on his back. And I said, "Oh, hello, Mr. Mayor." And he looked at me. He also knew that I was partly taking the mickey. I said, "Hi, Peter." And then I said, "Hi, Boris," and we had a brief word. But I just believe at one level, and I had a slightly comic version of this. I did the radio obituary of both Ted Heath and Margaret Thatcher, which was really interesting to do. And I interviewed Robert Runcie because he'd been at Oxford with Thatcher after the war. He'd got his MC, very courageous in the war, but been a bit of a hellraiser. They all came back, all the tensions of the war. Then there was the rather prim Margaret Roberts studying her chemistry. He knew it then. Roll on 30 years. She was Prime Minister, he was Archbishop of Canterbury. And she believed in treating the Archbishop respectfully. And I remember him telling me he wandered in, they were at some great event. And he said, glad rags again, Margaret. But anyway, the point of this anecdote was we got on very well. We talked. Whenever I bumped into him, I'd say, round Parliament, I'd say, "Your Grace." He said, "Oh, don't be silly, Peter. Call me Robert." And I couldn't do that with an Archbishop.
That is an interesting one, isn't it? And I think it is partly generational, although I remember doing a long interview with Theresa May, and I mean, I'd known her for years, and I would normally have called her Theresa, but in the interview, it was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
It felt weird, though. It didn't feel natural.
I think that there's something slightly different with Prime Minister. I mean, I've over my career and mixed with a lot of distinguished public servants and so on. And, of course, some of them by now, some of them are quite a bit younger than me. But even those older than me, I remember quite well with successive cabinet secretaries. So I know well, Robert Armstrong, the man from Spycatcher in Westland, who was a lovely guy, lovely driver.
He looked like a cabinet secretary, didn't he?
Absolutely. And he... well, the story I remember, there's a group which studies prime ministers, as you know, based in Number 10, and it's a combination of some academics and some civil servants. And they had a meeting right in the middle of, I'm thinking, 2015 election. Yes, it must have been 2015 election. And I was going out with Robert Armstrong and Robin Butler, both of whom I knew Rob well, and I know Robin very well. And it was after the famous Andrew Mitchell thing with the bike in the gate. Clubgate. And we were going out, and Robert put his hand on my arm and said, "Let's wait a minute." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Want to see how Robin, his protégé, the head prefect of Whitehall, the most distinguished public servant, how he treated the police with his bike." Because he collected his bike. And of course, being Robert Butler, he was the most polite and manageable thing. He said to, what are you two doing here? And I had the giggles at this point. These immense public servants. But they were... so it's very interesting with certain... I find that age brings on much greater formality. I mean, it'd be daft for me to call Robin Butler or someone like Andrew Turnbull, who's a good friend of mine, Lord Turnbull or Lord Butler, because I know them so well. Yeah. And I've got to know them well over several decades.
But also when you're interviewing people, I mean, a lot of the politicians that I interview, or some of them, have been either are or were good friends.
Yeah.
And that sometimes can be a challenge, because I've obviously come into this from the other side. And I've got over that now. I don't really care if I know the person. They I think, get the same treatment. Or David Davis and Brandon Lewis say that I give them a much harder time because I know them. But when you're doing a lengthy interview, and I think this would probably be the same for a print journalist too, if there's a degree of informality, it develops into a conversation, And the interviewee relaxes, and you get more out of them that way. Whereas if it's Mr. This, Mrs. That, Prime Minister, it tends not to go that way.
I think it's very much dependent. I think it's a mutual thing. It's the politician accepting that you're not a PR man for them, basically.
Yeah.
And you've got to ask critical questions, provided they're fair questions. I always found that people sometimes, I mean, occasionally, I had run-ins with people I knew well. For example, Norman Lamont I'd first known when I was at Cambridge, and he used to come back for things. After Black Wednesday and Sterling being forced out in '92, I wrote some pretty tough things. And there was a period when he wouldn't speak to me. He was very hurt by it. I mean, I'm sure that I was least of his worries by a long way. But that didn't last long. And ever since then, I bump into him occasionally now, and we get on extremely well. But it's acceptance you're going to be critical some of the time. Someone who found that, two people I think found that difficult. One was John Major, and I got to know John Major, or rather he'd got to know me, because he was the most brilliant cultivator of journalists. There's a whole group of journalists in the 80s who were kind of rising or established figures in this small world of political journalism, who he cultivated. And he was a wonderful source, I mean, fantastic source of stories, I mean, contrary to his image. Anyway, I was in the States when he
What you mean is he's a good gossip?
Yes, he was more calculated than that. He was much more...
really?
he was more calculated. Oh, no. Much more calculated than that. But anyway, I was in the States when he became Prime Minister. And, I mean, it's quite a bizarre story. My old friend Jim Nocte had tickets for New Year's Eve at the opera, but Ellie, his wife, was pregnant with second child. And so Jim, I was over for Christmas, New Year from the States, said, do you want to come? I said, I'd love to. Who was there but John and Norman Major, just a month after, or so after he became Prime Minister. So it was the end of 90. And so I talked to him then, and it was kind of weird experience. It was almost like saying, I'm from Washington, and I hear you've got a new job. It was a bit, maybe. During the period when he was Prime Minister, my relations with him were quite prickly. And I found, because, you had to say the Tories were in a mess. I mean, I was lining the obvious. And he was quite difficult. Immediately after that, everything changed. I remember as soon as the state opening in '97, there was the Speaker had a party, and I was there, drinks party at lunchtime before the formal debate began. And he couldn't have been more charming. And ever since, I haven't seen him very often, but I see him a bit because we're both interested in cricket and so on. He couldn't have been more relaxed and easygoing. The other person who is of course Gordon Brown, who sadly, for all his good intentions, could never relax, and therefore.
But when he did, he was charm personified.
Yeah. I knew Brown quite well in the 80s. I mean, when I was in Washington, the British Embassy, in their stupidity, never cultivated him when he was shadow trade industry or whatever. So his office would ring me up and say, Gordon's coming through to do a lecture, he'd love to have a meal with you. So I arranged something, and one of the funniest things, we had a meal. He was doing a lecture in Georgetown on a Saturday morning, and he was flying out Saturday evening. And he said, we had dinner on the Friday night, and he said, you do anything tomorrow afternoon? No, not particularly. And he said, well, let's go around the bookshops. And for him, that was the policy bits of the bookshops. And roll on to when he was Chancellor, we were just chatting, and we were doing an interview with him. And he said, oh, funny, I put on an old coat on the weekend, Peter, and in it was letters we'd exchanged about the books I got in Washington. That was Gordon at his best, but he didn't have the cynicism which Blair had. Blair's relationship was much more cynical in a way. I mean, but he was much more relaxed. I mean, I found Blair. I used to see Blair quite a lot when he was Prime Minister, and he was. You knew you were being used, but he was very good at it. Gordon was always tense.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit about America, because you talked a couple of times about covering American politics. Were you offered the job, or did you actually sort of keep pestering to say, let me do this?
I didn't pester, actually. I would have done if it had. Now, I was offered it earlier than I expected. That I'd fallen in love with America aged 26, 27. And I'd gone over, and this was the time of exchange control, so it was quite tight. And my first afternoon there, I was walking around in Washington, and the helicopter landed on the ellipse, and the president, who was Gerry Ford at the time, got out. So the next trip I did was funny. Was the then US editor, a guy called Ulrich Martin, great guy, knew I was coming on holiday, said, we'd like to spend a couple of days on the campaign trail. So I covered the campaign train from New York via Pittsburgh to Chicago. So that was Jimmy Carter the first day, Fritz Mondale, who sadly recently died, and Rosalind Carter. We ended up with the original Mayor Daley greeting us in Chicago. I mean, and then I got the train from Chicago to New Orleans, and there was Gerry Ford with Ku Klux Klan demonstrators in Louisiana. I mean, you couldn't not. And I went back for all the campaigns, and I saw Reagan in action, and who, I say, brilliant campaigner, and so on and so forth. So I'd fallen in love with American politics then. What happened was, after the 87 election, there'd been a bit of a shift around in the FT. A guy called John Lloyd, wonderful journalist. He was due to go to Washington, but for some reason, I can't remember what it was now, couldn't do it. So I was on enough, not put in immediately, because they had a good, very good man who should have been there longer, actually, because he did a perfectly good job. And they said, we want you to go in 18 months' time, which was a ridiculously long time. So this was June 87, after the election. They want you to go at the end of 88. So but go over some of the election in 88, which I did. I went to conventions and all that stuff. Heard one of the worst speeches ever made at a convention by the governor of Arkansas, one Bill Clinton. And started at the end of 88 and I covered the elder Bush. So if it hadn't happened, I would have pushed for it. But funny if it happened, and I met my wife there, who's English, but she was working for The Economist. And so it was great. However, whilst I love it and remain fascinated by it, you realise you're an outsider. Some British journalists stay hooked on it. A number of friends of mine stay and become part of it. Often they marry American wives and so on and develop families there. But I realised the FT had big advantages because we were printed there and so on. You were still an outsider. And so compared with the access I had back here, and even though I had good access, it wasn't at the same.
Yeah. Have you been back to Washington recently?
I haven't been back for a lot of years.
Don't. It's totally different. I mean, my American experience actually is not that dissimilar to yours, but sort of 10 years. I first went to Washington in 87, was it 88? And it became my favourite place, and I would go 2 or 3 times a year for quite a lot of years. But you go back now, none of the things that we used to enjoy are there anymore, or they've closed down, or they've just become different. It's a shell of a city compared to what... I mean, it sounds like being an old git saying, of course, it's much better in my day. But it's actually quite sad.
No, we keep saying that, we were put off during the because I said my wife was there. She was there for longer than I was, because she was she was administrator of the Economist Washington bureau, not a journalist, but administrator, and she was there, and we had a bit of a transatlantic romance for some time, and so we both got ties there, but during the Trump era, neither of us particularly wanted to go back, but then COVID hit, so we probably will the next year or two. But I take your point on that. I mean, it's not. We had about 2 or 3 years ago, went to Chicago because my wife was doing the marathon there. She does a lot of running, as you can naturally gather. There's a natural affinity in that respect. And anyway, she was a winter Olympian in her youth.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She didn't
lose all sorts of things in this interview.
Yeah, exactly. Most people kind of look and say yes. Anyway, fortunately, she retired from that. Although we have been to the Olympic track she competed on, which is Lake Placid. Anyway, she had a period of about getting off for a decade, but she was competitive.
Wow.
And then had retired and was working with The Economist, and we met. And then actually it was only about 10, 15 years ago, she took up serious running and has run lots of marathons, which is great fun. And we're in Chicago, and we realised how much we loved Chicago. And we went, a couple of friends there, and the wife was also running. We're very good friends of ours, and so that made a lovely kind of long weekend. We haven't been as regular to the States as we used to.
Let's move on to something personal. Your daughter, you had her quite later in life,
absolutely.
didn't you? How was that experience being an older dad?
Fine. Absolutely fine. I mean, I say that now. She's about to be 25 in July. she's apart from natural pride, she has struck on her own track, because she went to Edinburgh, did a degree in mainly in Chinese language and history, lived in Taiwan for 10 months where we visited her, which was a fantastic place. And what happens there, heaven knows, but it's a wonderful, wonderful place. Fantastic food and culture. I mean, very interesting historically. And then she was in China when COVID broke out. She was working for an organisation helping interns in Chengdu, which is the home of the giant panda. She had a wonderful time there, a great time there. And she had a slightly hairy few weeks jumping around the Far East, to Taiwan, to Tokyo, and then to Fiji, where her cousin was teaching and family were, and then to Australia, where my brother-in-law is. And so she's done that, and then she's been with us working for an organisation which does marketing in China. And so and she's going to move out later this year. But no, it was late. But I may be different with a daughter. I mean, I was 47 when she was born, and I know she would give a very different view if she's sitting in this seat. But it's worked pretty well, and she's developed her own character and personality, and also talent for language and things which I never thought she would have. And so no, and it's in some respects I think it wouldn't have been great to have got married 10 years earlier, but my wife was doing her sports and so on, so it just happened we married when we did, and we both carried on being active. I mean that I think is one that's interesting that I found. I just enjoy doing things.
You moved from the FT to the Times in 1991. That must have been a big decision. You've been at the FT for 21 years, which most people think of, well, that's almost for life. Why did you move?
Well, you almost put it exactly that way, Ian, because I'd been, since I left university, I've been there 21 years. If I'd remained on the FT, I would have had some very senior jobs. I wouldn't have become editor.
Why?
Oh, I just don't think I'd have quite fitted. I mean, I hadn't done enough financial stuff. I was too wedded to the political scene. I was regarded as a bit of a political obsessive. And
fairly.
Well, fairly, no, I can't argue with that. I thought there'd be more scope for me to do. I was approached by, in fact, Peter Riddell, who was then my opposite number in Washington, on behalf of Simon Jenkins during Simon's brief period editing the Times, and approached to do political commentary and column. I thought if I was ever going to work for someone different at the age of, what was I then, 42, 43, now is the time to change, essentially. Otherwise, I'd have a very comfortable existence, well-paid, comfortable existence on the FT. And oddly enough, the then editor of the FT, or just taken over, Richard Lambert, who was a very good friend of mine, now chair of the British Museum and done all various things in between. He was actually, I mean, the fact we maintained our friendship at the time and subsequently has been very important. He understood that, if I was going to, he said, look, here's what your future's likely to be, and it would have been nice, interesting jobs. But I thought I didn't want to work for one paper all my career, which is effectively what I've been doing if I turned down the Times.
And what differences did you notice in culture, demands, relationships?
Well, there was always the shadow of one Rupert Murdoch. That whilst I was remote from it, my friend Peter Hennessy says I was a professor in the Tower, and there's quite an element of truth in that. That because I was almost employed to do my own thing. I was the licensed centrist to do centrist commentary. I wasn't the controversialist. They had lots of good columnists around to write spiky columns. I would be the kind of slightly authoritative but fairly centrist analysis. That was fine, because that's my temperament anyway. And I was sufficiently distant from the power centres. It was much more of, but Murdoch was and is the Sun King. It was really interesting when he came on visits over. It was him. And everything at a certain level in the organisation stopped, and everyone paid court to him. I only met him 2 or 3 times. I got on with him fine. I mean, he remains the figure. Les Hinton wrote a rather good book, who had been the MD at Wapping, because Les had been out in Australia with him and then came back and rose through the hierarchy. Brutal Boy, it's called. That's right.
Yeah, I've got it, but I haven't read it yet.
It's a very interesting book about, it's like at the end, I wouldn't say disenchantment, but distance from Murdoch. Everyone Virtually everyone, and there are exceptions. They fall out eventually.
But it's interesting that you were there for so long, but only actually met him a few times.
Yeah, mainly because I wasn't part of the kind of hierarchy, particularly. I was mainly at Westminster, of course, for all but 3 years of times. I was based at Westminster. And so I didn't have that much contact. And I was wheeled out occasionally, but because I wasn't kind of particularly ideological, But
you see, if I was Rupert Murdoch, and there's a thought, I would be thinking on my visits to London, Peter Riddell, he knows where all the bodies are buried. I'm going to have a chat with him.
It didn't. I partly remember there were several titles, so it was someone like Trevor Kavanagh was the person Trevor was the person who'd be brought in to see him, or the head of our news operation, Phil Webster, who was the news opposite number to me as commentator. It was more them than me. I think it's probably regarded as a bit straight-laced and prim for...
But how hands-on was he with the Times? Because the reputation is always very hands-on, but I've always doubted that.
It was two main things, which of course are crucial things in a newspaper: appointment of editors and dismissal of editors. They were there at his pleasure. Yeah. He looked after them afterwards on the whole. They all went off and got good jobs, but that was that. And money. The price cutting. Remember, there was enormous price cutting campaigns during the 90s. Well, that was Murdoch. He was not involved in day-to-day things or anything like that. I didn't see any sign of that whatsoever, and nor anything like that at all. And indeed, I was left pretty free.
And what about when decisions were made about which party the paper would support at elections? Would he get involved in that, or was that left to the editor?
Largely left to the editor. But after discussion, I'm largely left to the editor. I mean, when under Robert Thompson, now the big honcho in the States, when Robert was editor and the paper backed Blair in 2001, 2005, that would have been discussed. But also the Tories weren't in any shape at the time as it was. I mean, it was following power, which what Murdoch does, and I always felt that the politicians were too much in awe of him. They were too. They went too far when basically he'd be following his own calculations. Fair enough, he's a businessman.
In the Blair years, I remember at the time everyone thought, well, the Times is basically in Blair's pocket. You had Tom Baldwin, basically a creature of Alistair Campbell. Maybe I'm exaggerating to make a point. Phil Webster always seemed to get the stories from Number 10. Did you feel that at the time, that maybe there was a little bit too much closeness?
I think there probably was too much closeness. But however, the Tories weren't in any fit state to... I mean, it was more a reflection of where power lay. The other thing, which is what Alistair Campbell and Peter Mandelson and Tony Blair, they were very expert at placing the story, giving the interview. We'd have our 6-monthly interview with Blair, and Phil and I, and... You don't say no to that.
No, absolutely.
And also it was a generational thing. I mean, I'd known Brown and Blair. John Smith said to me, and Jim Lockley and I were having dinner with John Smith. Typically says a lot about the three of us at the time, late at night in Soho after a division. And we were in 83, must have been 83, 84, probably 83. And saying, OK, who should we look at in the new Labour intake? It was Gordon Brown and Tony Blair, of course, in that order, very crucially. And I got to know them very well then. So, in a sense, that was a follow-on from that. I mean, it was a long time of knowing them. I think you're probably right. The Times was slightly uncritical, but there wasn't much else around. And it reached its kind of crisis point over the Iraq War and the various things that happened then, and so on. And that produced a lot of tension, within the paper. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned some of the people. Well, there was a lot of tension during that period. There was also Michael Ashcroft's book about what happened, and one or two things like that,
which I had a hand in. In fact, I'll tell you a little story about that. I don't know if I've ever told you this. We should explain that Michael Ashcroft and the Times had a, shall we say, a rather bitter dispute, and he wrote his version of events, and he wanted to call it Dirty Politics. And I was running Politicos at the time, and I'd never met him before, and I got a message from his PA to say, Michael Ashcroft would like to see you. Could you come and report at our office in Cowley Street at this time on this date? How strange. So I duly went down, and he came in. He said, I've written a book. I want you to read it now. And I basically was locked in his office for a couple of hours reading this book. And he said, we haven't got a final title yet either. So I read it, and that was actually rather good, I thought. So he came down, and I said, well, you've called it Dirty Politics. It's okay as a title. What about calling it Dirty Politics, Dirty Times? And he said, you and I are going to get on very well. Yeah, that's quite an experience.
But that was all a kind of very fraught period, which I found pretty tough, because that wasn't and when things develop into feuds, it becomes quite difficult, particularly if you're doing the type of political journalism I had. And so, but I found the Times, I mean, gradually I got squeezed really from, I suppose, 05 onwards, partly a matter of age. I was then in my late 50s, getting on to 60. New editors appeared, James Harding appeared.
Obviously, I'm being squeezed as well, Peter. I know
Exactly.
the feeling.
No outlets. But also, and now I'm again to get interested in other things. I became chairman of the Hansard Society. I developed one or two other interests. I was writing books for you. And I found, I'd thought, get out in time. And the Institute of Government was being set up. And I'd funny enough written the first piece on it, because I vaguely knew David Sainsbury, who was the chairman and the funder. And I wrote something, and I bumped into the master of Nudge, David Halpin, at a party, who was his research director. I was going to be the setting up research. And I said, how's your institute going? And he said, oh, we're looking for part-time research fellows. And I said, what about me? And that was one of the best meetings I ever had. And and James Harding indicated that he didn't really want my commentaries in perpetuity. So I moved to part-time on the Times and part-time in the Institute for Government. And I left after the 2010 election. Again, something fantastic. On my last day on the Times, which was the end of June, I was clearing my desk. I had a phone call from the late Jeremy Hayward, who was then in Downing Street, saying, we're setting up an inquiry into detainees and rendition. Would you like to serve on it? And I was vaguely aware of it all. And I said, I haven't got any time to think about it. He said, no, I want an answer now, which is very Jeremy. I got appointed that. And it was a fantastic 18 months. And it was part-time. It was a couple of days a week. Yeah. So I combined that with the Institute for Government. And, here was I going around the intelligence agencies, seeing top secret things. I never know how I was vetted or what I was. And the thing collapsed for all kinds of reasons, legal reasons. But as an 18 months, boy, it was really interesting. And then the directorship of the IFG came up. And because the inquiry was collapsing, I threw my hat in the ring for that. And so I had 4.5 years of that. And that was great. And then you became the Commissioner for Public Appointments. Commissioner for Public Appointments. Which sounds terribly grand. and I think everyone must think, oh, he's the guy that decides who gets all the honours. But it's not quite like that, is it? No, it is not like
Otherwise,
that.
I'd have one.
Of course you would, Ian. I know, it's nothing to do with honours. Well, I was on one of the honours committees, but that's a different story. My time at the IFG was coming to an end. I accepted that it's a very demanding job running it. And I've been talking to people in Whitehall, and this role came up. What I do is a regulator. I don't appoint anyone. What I make sure of, or try and do, is that the thousands of appointments made by ministers to arm's length public bodies and things like the prison visitors, independent monitoring boards, parole boards, local hospital boards, and so on, are made in accordance with the code. And sometimes that results in battles with various ministers, which I've had a few of recently. And so I don't appoint anyone, but I do regulate it. I have a tiny team of 2 people, and I've just been extended until the end of September. My term was due to run out at the end of April, but the government is not yet ready to announce my successor. And they asked me in mid-March, when I do a bit longer. I said, I believe that regulators should have fixed term, shouldn't be there forever, but you have to have a commissioner, because I don't have a deputy, and I'm a commissioner without a commission. It's just me and my 2 advisors. And so I said I'll do it over the summer, but then I'm off. I don't know how much detail you can go into, but when you have a battle with a minister, how does that
I mean, is there an example you can give us, or just talk generally about the toing and froing that goes on?
It happens in various ways, Ian. It means that sometimes it's kind of a rolling thing, that as a particularly prominent appointment, and you talk to the department, mainly civil servants, it's mainly done with civil servants rather than with ministers, and you talk to them about how the competition is going to be run, and you look at the interview panel, which is crucial, and then I express you. I have to be consulted on, I won't go into the details of it, but on big appointments as an independent person, they have to consult me on the appointment of that. And sometimes ministers try and appoint people who are too close to them in various ways. And the code, it's the government's code, it's not my code. In fact, it was designed by Matt Hancock and Jerry Grimstone, more than anyone else. So I monitor it in relation to the code. And there's to and fro. There was a problem last autumn over the Office of Students appointment, and I objected to the overall balance of the interview panel, which I thought was slanted, and I expressed that publicly, which created a lot of. But when I say fuss, but not hostile necessarily. I mean, I got a number of people saying, "You got a point there," and it's always a mistake to think of Whitehall as monolithic. It's much more. And this is not necessarily ministers versus all servants. It cross-cuts. So what happens is there is a debate, you're called in, I express things publicly. I did a speech recently expressing concern about independence, degree of independence. I express that, you get some feedback from people. It's a slightly odd process. It's not, it's opaque in a way. You express things, you get a reaction or don't get a reaction.
But do you have a power of veto?
No, I have a power, I will say a power of embarrassment. I can say, I think there's something wrong here. And Whitehall hates that. For certain things, they have to come to me to get agreement. And that's not a veto. It's an advice. They can overrule me. But overruling means the thing becomes public.
Yeah.
I mean, ministers have
But they did on the Office of Students.
No, they didn't, because I was just
so you weren't objecting to the person that it was James Wharton, I think.
That's right.
Who was close to Boris Johnson, but you were objecting to the interview panel rather than necessarily him.
Exactly. I never express a view on individuals appointed. That's entirely a matter for ministers to justify.
Yeah.
You know, it's up to Gavin Williamson to make the case for James Wharton. Mine was the process itself I had objections to. He, in appointing the panel, was exercising his powers. I just felt it conflicted with some of the principles of the code. But I mean, it's an embarrassment factor, and it's also there's a lot. I'm also the representative of candidates and appointees. No one else is going to stand up for them for me. A lot of them, people applying for public appointments have to wait for months to be appointed. So I'm chivying them. We did a big report a couple of years ago on the length of time it takes for these competitions. It should be 3 months. Only half the competitions meet the 3-month target. Some of them go to 5 months and longer. So that's something I make a fuss about. I look at remuneration, not the top fat cats, the chairs, but if you're going to get a much more diverse range of people, that type of thing I get involved in. It's very satisfying because you're working with good candidates. The people who run public bodies on the whole are very sensible and long-suffering.
And they're not particularly lucrative, these appointments, are they? I get the weekly thing that sort of lists all. I've never actually applied for one in my life, but you would not do it for the money generally.
No. And also, there's a further twist to it. They keep telling you, oh, it's 1 or 2 days a week. I've never met anyone. I remember when I meet chairs of public bodies, they say, Peter, do you work longer than you advertise? I said, yeah. What about you? Yeah. And it's quite funny because when they extended my role, they said, and Peter will carry on working for 2 to 3 days a week, which I thought was very funny, given that my job is actually advertised for 1 or 2 days a week. So I sent a slightly tongue-in-cheek email to the people concerned. So I'm glad you've got a realistic view of the time. So you work longer. They're not well paid. Half of public appointees don't have any money, aren't paid at all. And there's no rhyme or reason on pay. And I'm trying to push the debate on that, but it's more to raise the profile. And this is also, I mean, diversity can have all kinds of connotations, but I view it genuinely. It's getting a wide range of people, and geographically, one of my big things is COVID has produced real opportunities. We're used to remote working. Well, if you've got caring responsibilities or disabled, well, why shouldn't you be part of a public board, but you don't have all the hassle of coming into London?
Yeah.
Well, perhaps you do twice a year, but not 6 times a year. That's the type of thing I'm trying to stir up.
So you're, what, 72?
Yep.
You're finishing this job at the end of September.
Yep.
What are you going to do next? I can't see you retiring.
No. I've got 1 or 2 ideas in mind of things I'd like to do part-time. Also, some writing. I want to do some more writing. It depends on what works out in 1 or 2 things I want to do, which are in the kind of the type of area I've been involved in for the last few years. I'd like to carry on, but not as the intensity I'm doing now. And also, I'm giving up my chairmanship as a governess at Dulwich, which has been a pretty demanding job, and of course that's a charity, so nothing in that financially. And that I leave at the end of July, so I'm going to have more time. But some writing. I definitely want to do some more writing because I enjoy doing that. And my recent writing has been entirely for your collections. I'm waiting for popes and.
I'm not sure I'm going to do popes. But, well, Peter, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for joining us on Iain Dale All Talk. That's it for today. We'll see you next time. Goodbye.